Lawyers of Reddit. What's the most ridiculous argument you've heard in court? Story 1. I'm a lawyer. The most ridiculous argument I've seen was one I actually made. One of my clients got busted cooking meth. This was a very clear-cut case. They actually caught him in the middle of a cook. No way he was getting out of this one. Even worse, he was cooking at home, and children were there. Yep, the DA loaded him up with felonies. There was no bail, and he was being held in the county jail. My client knew he had been planning to get married a few weeks after he got busted. My client asked me if he can get released for 24 hours so he can still get married. I tell him that he'll ask, but that there's no way and they'll let him out. First, I asked the DA if they will allow it. Nope, they laugh, so I file a motion with the court. Now, I knew the judge was a crusty old conservative family values kind of guy who also has a raging erection for drug crime. There was no law involved, but I put together an argument about the sanctity of marriage and how the state should encourage marriage at all times, and that sort of thing. We have a hearing, and I make the argument. The DA is totally opposed and calls it ridiculous, and the judge grants it. The judge actually decided to allow my client out for 24 hours to get married. He had to surrender at the county jail at 8 a.m. the next day, and some other conditions, but still he was allowed out. Everyone is stunned. Nobody can believe it. The day of the wedding comes, my client gets out, gets married, then goes back to the jail. Everything went exactly like how it was supposed to, which is also pretty shocking. Story 2. Former assistant state attorney prosecutor here. This defendant is called up for arraignment, and the judge is telling him that he's been charged with theft for stealing a roll of scratch-off tickets from a gas station. The judge informs the defendant that since the value of the tickets was over $300, therefore, it's a felony rather than a misdemeanor. The defendant says to the judge, "But Your Honor, to be fair, the tickets were all losers, implying it's not theft at all." I was amazed at the ingenuousness yet futility of the argument. Story 3. I'm a lawyer. I should win right there. Anyway, we were in trial. An opposing counsel was objecting to a document I was trying to enter into evidence through one of their witnesses. The witness had identified it as one of their business records, but opposing counsel objects. Jury is in the courtroom, so the judge has us approach. We do, and opposing counsel argues the authenticity of the document. I was a little surprised, so my response was, "Your Honor, this is their exhibit." Is counsel stating they submitted inauthentic documents to this court? Judge turns to counsel. "Are you submitting non-authentic documents?" Opposing counsel stammers out a no, and the document goes in. I was a little surprised they wanted to argue their own document wasn't authentic just to keep me from getting it to the jury. Story 4. I am a lawyer. The state tried to argue that probable cause exists simply because there is a police report alleging the crime. From the fact that a police officer filed this report, it is a reasonable inference that the crime took place as described. Good. Allegations are self-proving now. Well, wrap up court then. I guess no need to hear any more motions to dismiss ever. I wonder why no other prosecutor in 240 years of jurisprudence ever thought of that before. 25-year-old assistant district attorney who went to the worst law school in this state. Story 5. Made a left turn on a green turn arrow. A city bus ran a red and T-boned me. My car was a little VW Rabbit, so it just scooted me, and I was perfectly fine. Driver pulls over, comes out, and says the sun was in my eyes. I say I'm not hurt. Thanks for asking. Police arrive, and guess what? There was a literal busload full of witnesses. Everyone had the same story. She ran a red. City paid for my car, etc. She denied wrongdoing and went to court, which I had to attend along with a witness or two and the officer. Her defense, she had a migraine. Judge, so I should let you off the hook because you had a bad headache and was driving into the sun. Driver, yes, Your Honor, I'm glad you understand. She got her commercial vehicle license revoked. Should have just taken the points. Story 6. Traffic court. Speeding ticket. Your Honor, I didn't speed, and I can prove it with logic. Judge, okay. Lady, I drive a Prius. Judge, lady, that proves I'm responsible, specifically in the realm of cars, so I obviously wouldn't speed. She had to pay the ticket. Story 7. I have a brief encounter. Personal injury prospect. Old lady slipped, fell on an icy driveway, which was not salted or maintained, so she wanted to sue for damages. After hearing the story, turns out the lady fell on her own driveway, which she did not salt maintain. She was wanting to sue herself. Story 8. Not so much ridiculous as ghastly, but a man accused of raping his own daughter, saying he couldn't have done so because he had a 9-inch and it would have caused her damage, and that the physical signs of activity that she did exhibit were because she'd been screwing the family dog. I don't do criminal law anymore. That was enough for me. Edit. Lots of people asking what happened. Should probably have put that in here originally. ID left the firm by the time it actually got a trial, but was kept in the loop about the case by friends still there. He was found guilty and went off to prison. Story 9. Law student. Former professor's story. Defendant busted for possession of narcotics. They were in the pocket of his leather jacket. He argues the search was illegal because with his buttery smooth leather jacket, There's no way the officer would have felt the drugs in his pocket during a pat-down, so he shouldn't have reached in the pocket to find the drugs in the first place. Judge asks if the jacket is the one he was currently wearing in court. It was. Judge asks to feel this jacket in the pockets. Defendant hands it to the bailiff. Judge finds more drugs in the pocket. Needless to say, it didn't go well for him. Story 10. I was in the public gallery for this while studying law. I was not the lawyer. Leeds Crown Court back in the early 90s. 75 years old foreign, yes. This important man was facing a preliminary hearing and relating to charges that he had touched a 13-years-old relative. His barrister made a successful plea for bail based upon this man being an established pillar of the immigrant community, and the judge asked the old man if he had anything to say before he was bailed until the next hearing in a month. He made two comments. One, she was wearing very, very tight shorts, and I should not be held responsible, because no real man could see something like that. The judge reminded this was a preliminary hearing, not a trial, so he should wait until the trial to argue his case, especially statements that are far from exculpatory and are better suited to mitigation. 2, I cannot reappear in a month because I'm flying back to my home country tomorrow and will not be coming back. The barrister appeared to be just as surprised as the rest of us. The judge ordered the defendant's passport seized, and he was remanded in custody until his trial. Story 11. I am a lawyer. Had a female inmate claim she was molested by one of the guards. One of her most damning pieces of testimony was testifying to this large vertical scar he had on his chest from a heart operation. She continued to say that she remembered this huge scar from when he molested her. The guard got on the stand, took his shirt off, and he had a tiny horizontal scar up on his shoulder. Case over, he had apparently told her one time that he had surgery, and she assumed it would have left his giant scar and used that to make up her story. Edit to clarify, I was a new clerk for the judge when the trial started. I don't know exactly why this didn't come out in discovery. My guest plaintiff's counsel were 2 years out of law school, appointed to the case, had only done corporate law, and were from a monster NYC firm, so probably didn't give it any time. As for the defense, either the Department of Corrections wanted to publicly humiliate the inmate people make a lot of dumb decisions based on a screw you mentality, or defense counsel wanted to get that trial money. Story 12, not a lawyer, but was the child in a custody case between my parents. My mother's lawyer argued for and had put in the final agreement that I had to add my mother as a Facebook friend. Edit, this was 7 years ago. We were still not friends on Facebook, and she's blocked on everything I have an account for. Story 13, this never made it to court. I asked my divorce lawyer what was the worst thing a client had asked him to argue. I was expecting a I want the salad spinner sort of story. He had a client, a professor in his 70s who was divorcing from his wife, also a professor in her 70s. They were both Jewish. His wife had a tattoo on her arm. It was a number put there by the Nazis when they put her in a concentration camp in WW2 as a child. Husband was born in the U.S., was not German. The German government was in the process of settling a case with the survivors. She had some amount of money, a 6-figure sum, due to her. The husband wanted his lawyer to argue that he should get half the settlement money. Lawyer told him that there was a special circle in for lawyers who asked for stuff like that, and that he was not planning on ending up there. Story 14, also a lawyer. Had opposing counsel try to argue that because a landlady had written on her eviction notice, it has been a pleasure getting to know you, but please leave, but had testified they were awful tenants that she hated, that she was dishonest, and nothing she said could be trusted, opened the question of dishonesty wide open. Although landlady wasn't an angel, tenants had an enormous string of fraud priors we could tell the court about as a result. Edit, because of confusion around impeachability doors, this is UK law and relates to gateways for admissibility of bad character evidence. Story 15, prosecutor here. Had a case where a man raped his 6-year-old daughter because she wore suggestive clothing and seemed to be asking for it. He tried to argue that, girls are just active at a younger age now. I remember thinking, what would Dexter do? Anyway, man got convicted and is now serving 2 life sentences plus 100 years. Edit, the reason for that sentence is that he will not be eligible for parole. He was convicted of 2 counts of rape, 2 counts of, and 2 counts of aggravated child molestation. In my jurisdiction, you're eligible for parole on a life sentence after 30 years life, and life without parole are 2 different sentences. Here, he was not eligible for life without parole. So in theory at least, yes, he could serve 2 consecutive life sentences, which would be 60 years, and then parole. Now, however, we are certain he never draws another breath as a free man. I've done several of these cases, and to me, they're much harder than murder cases because of the pressure. In this case, the man had no other complaints than this as a father, so if I lost, the poor girl goes back to rapist dad. Story 16, not a lawyer, but when my mom was killed by a drunk driver, we were filing a wrongful death suit. And the lawyer for the defense used my mom's cancer to say that she was going to die anyway, so a wrongful death dispensation was not owed. Story 17. Several years ago, I was doing a civil trial personal injury, defending a woman who allegedly hit a bus matron with her car. We had offered to concede liability and just try damages. In other words, the jury wouldn't hear the circumstances of how the injury happened, just that we agreed my client caused the injury, and they would only decide the amount of damages. We had evidence that the plaintiff was significantly exaggerating her injuries. The plaintiff's attorney refused to agree to our concession, thinking that if the jury heard the circumstances, they'd want to give even more money to punish my client. So we went to trial on liability. The plaintiff called one witness, her client, who testified that an older woman in a green car hit her. They rested, and I moved for a dismissal for failure to prove a case. There was literally no evidence connecting my client to this incident. Just an older woman in a green car. The plaintiff never bothered to call my client to the stand. The attorney told the judge that the bus driver had written down my client's license plate and gave it to the police. They never bothered trying to find the bus driver. The attorney asked if she could just put the police report in, and I objected that it was hearsay. The attorney then actually said, "Please just let me put this in. I haven't had work in a while, and I got retained by a firm to try this case. I really need to win this." Of course, I didn't agree, and the judge dismissed the case. I felt a little bad for her, but that was maybe the worst presentation of a case I ever saw. I spoke with the jury afterwards, and they all said they hated the plaintiff, didn't believe a word she said, and likely would have found in my favor anyway. Moral of the story: be prepared in court. Story 18. I'm a prosecutor now, but I used to have a private practice where I did a lot of evictions. My usual landlord clients wouldn't even come into my office until their tenants had been behind for months, and most of the time the tenants were defiant in their non-payment, so it wasn't difficult to not take pity on them. Anyway, one tenant was a particularly dumb guy. He usually came to court dressed in a wife beater and cut-off jeans. We had a trial date set, and my client and I showed up. Tenant did not. At the last second before the judge entered a default, some woman comes bursting into the courtroom and yells. Daryl's on the phone. The judge allows her to bring the phone up, and we put tenant on speaker. He proceeds to ask the judge to delay the trial for 1 week because my brother got his head knocked inside out and is probably gonna die. I didn't buy it, but my client knew Daryl well enough to sense the stress and fear in his voice. I told the judge that we would allow the continuance, but only until the next available court day. The judge set it for 1 week out. I still didn't believe Daryl until that night my grandfather was in an accident, and we had to rush to the hospital. As we're walking up the hallway, I see Daryl in a room with a bunch of people who dress like him enough to obviously be family. When we get to my grandpa's room, he ended up being not as seriously injured as we originally feared. The first thing he says is, "You'll never guess what happened to the guy down the hall." Nurse told me his idiot brother dropped a tractor bucket on his head and opened it like a cracked egg. He's in a coma now. I relayed the news to my client, and she felt sorry enough for Daryl that we signed an agreement stating that he would clear out within 15 days and we would forgive all back rent owed. Story 19. Not a lawyer, but I was in traffic court and a cab driver had got a ticket for running a red. He argued that it was really difficult to see because the sun was rising morning right where the light was. He was traveling west. Story 20. As with everyone else in this thread, I'm not a lawyer, but did work in court. Had multiple mothers in separate cases claim that they couldn't be sent to prison because it breached their European Union right to a family life. I can only assume they got it from something like the Daily Mail because they all used that same phrasing. Edit: yes, this was at least in the UK. Story 21. Had a pro-SE litigant argue that she did know the credit card company because Jesus. The basic argument was that debt is a sin, or maybe not paying the debt was a sin, and Jesus died for all of our sins. Therefore, Jesus died to pay off her debt. Brilliant. Story 22. Not a lawyer, because they don't exist. I got a ticket for expired parking meter. Went in and contested it. The guy says the parking authority took some pictures for evidence. How do you explain these? The pictures included my car, my license plate, and the parking meter, which clearly showed 13 minutes left on it. Story 23. Actual lawyer. What I dubbed the surprise party defense in a hearing for an order of protection in which ex-wife is trying to get an order of protection against ex-husband who had been stalking her. They have a high school-age child together. Ex-husband tries to argue against the order of protection by saying they may need to be able to communicate about the child. The judge points out that they can communicate through the child, and also that other family members have been put in place by the juvenile court to be intermediaries, re-pick-up, drop-off, etc. Then ex-husband has a brilliant light bulb idea. Judge: what if I need to throw my son a surprise party, and I need to keep it secret from everyone, but his mom still needs to know, so she doesn't throw a party the same day? In other words, while I admit have been stalking my ex-wife, and that there are grounds to grant an order of protection, You should not grant that order just in case I need to throw a surprise party one day. What made it was how clever he thought the argument was. Thus was born the surprise party defense. Edit, a lot of you are upset about the comment of communicating through the child. That was probably a poor way to phrase it. In this situation, the father would be barred from passing messages to the mother through the child. You can't say, tell your mom X, but of course some indirect communication is going to occur. And that is what the judge was referring to. In other words, the father cannot argue that he needs to be able to have direct communication with the mother for purposes of coordinating childcare. Things like that, which is often the issue. Because the child in this case is old enough to tell both parents, for example, about school, friends, trips, grades, etc. It is not as if the judge ordered the child to be the intermediary. That is ridiculous. Also, I sort of simplified the complexities of it because these people's parental arrangement was not the point. The dumbness of the argument was the point, but this is a criminal judge determining an order of protection. There's a whole separate juvenile family court judge that actually determines the custody arrangement and things of that nature. The bottom line is, the guy was trying to use the kid as an excuse to avoid an order of protection so he could continue to stalk and harass his ex-wife. Story 24 wasn't the other lawyer, but his client took the stand in a retail theft trial. Claimed he didn't steal a couple salmon fillets on purpose. He was just so flustered by a phone conversation with his girlfriend that he accidentally slipped them into the pockets of his jacket in a part of the store the loss prevention officer called Shoplifter Alley, because it's a blind spot for the cameras, and walked out without realizing it. It's not like it was a candy bar or something small. It was 2 salmon fillets. I asked him, have you ever done that before? Him, no. Me, have you ever seen anyone anywhere ever put fish like that in their pocket in your entire life? Him, no. Mercifully, the jury did not buy his ludicrous story and found him guilty. Story 25, long-time lurker, but I couldn't resist this one. Not a lawyer, but I was called as a witness to testify for the state regarding an accident that I was involved in. I was hit from behind by a large construction dump truck while sitting at a red light behind another vehicle. It was a 4-lane roadway that merged into 2 after the light, and I was in the right lane heading north. The light turned green, and I hadn't moved yet because I felt the vehicle tap mine. Next thing I know, I'm moving forward, and I begin to panic that something's wrong with my car. Well, apparently the driver of the dump truck didn't realize head hit me and pushed me straight through the intersection, and my car ended up doing a 180, and I was facing south heading towards a very deep ditch. I was blaring my horn and hitting my brakes and tried to avoid going in the ditch because my son was not even 1 month old at the time, and in the back seat along with my dog. I managed to pull the parking brake, and we slide to a stop just at the edge of the road before the ditch. Husband turns and asks, do I need to call 911? I tell him no because I see the dump truck pull over to the side a bit north of me, and I figure he'll come out to exchange insurance. Lo and behold, the driver took off after about 15 seconds of sitting there. I was stunned, but immediately told hubby to then call 911. That way being a hit or run. Sheriff comes. People from the company that hit us come. Witnesses who saw the whole thing tell the sheriff what happened, and company apologizes. They start looking for the driver through the GPS on the vehicle. Company ended up paying $2,000 in damage to my car and paid for a brand new car seat. Pictures were taken by all parties as well of the damage present to my car. So imagine my surprise when I got subpoenaed to appear in court to testify against this guy. I can't believe the nerve of this that hit me, ran, and had to testify not guilty to the charge. The day comes and I show up in court. Give my testimony. Witness gives hers. Sheriff gives his. A bit of banter back and forth about a surveillance video from a gas station that the driver obtained, but his lawyer didn't bother to enter into evidence before the trial. Judge won't allow her to show video because state hasn't had time to review it. We finally get to hear the driver's testimony, and he gave the best excuse that could be summed up like this. I didn't see her car as I was pulling up to the light. I was giving enough distance to stop the car in front of her, but I didn't see her. I didn't hear the horn blaring because I was in a diesel vehicle and didn't realize that ID hit her or that I was even involved in an accident. And that's why I didn't stop. ID been having brake issues and thought it was just my brakes acting up. He apparently thought he could win his case by testifying that because he didn't see me and didn't realize he was in an accident, he shouldn't be charged with the accident and failure to remain at the scene of the accident. Sorry. Ignorance of events doesn't make you any less liable in the eyes of the law. Judge pronounced him guilty, and the guy rolled his eyes like he couldn't believe it. I'm still waiting to find out if he tries to appeal it. Edit typo. Story 26, my uncle did malpractice defense. Well, 1 year he had to defend a surgeon. The patient said after his elbow surgery, he couldn't play tennis anymore. They went through weeks of work trying to figure out what went wrong and why all of a sudden this guy couldn't play tennis, because according to all the evidence, the surgery went fine and he should be good. Then, right before recess, my uncle stopped and asked, sir, Have you ever played tennis before? The guy said, well, no, but I've always wanted. The case got dismissed. Story 27. Oh geez, where do I start? I mean, I could tell plenty of these about my own clients, but I like this one. A lady has an injury comp case. It's for her upper back and, of course, complex regional pain syndrome. She decides she needs the insurance company to pay for a special mattress for her, like a 6,000 memory foam with heat and massage and 1,000 other features, and not just a twin. She needs a California king because, of course, her layabout unemployed boyfriend needs to sleep there too. We spend months litigating this thing. Finally, she buys it herself, and my client agrees to give her $1,500 just to be done with it. The judge takes myself and opposing counsel aside and says he's going to mother or fuck us if we ever say the word mattress in his court again after wasting all this time. It was that ridiculous. Not 3 months go by, and the case comes on for another hearing. After exhausting all the chiropractic care allowed under the law, her doctor was seeking a variance to get some additional chiropractic. We get to court, and am arguing it should be denied, etc. Judge turns to her and says, ma'am, why do you feel you need more chiropractic care? She pauses for a minute, then says, I'm having a lot of trouble sleeping on my mattress. I think I saw smoke coming out of his ears. Story 28. I was a juror, but this was of a defense. Defendant ran through a red light and crossed against traffic in front of an officer. She was over twice the limit. It wasn't her fault. She had a cut on her arm that her dog licked. The yeast from the dog's saliva entered her bloodstream and converted her blood sugar into alcohol. Story 29. I wasn't a lawyer, but a law clerk working with the prosecutor's office. This guy was caught on the highest quality security cam video I've ever seen, stabbing a store clerk like 15 times. She survived, and then was tackled a block away from the scene not 5 minutes later by a man who had seen him flee and followed him 25 feet from a knife and the jacket had been wearing that was covered in blood with a receipt with his name on in the pocket. It was the literal definition of a slam dunk case. The guy chose to proceed to trial without his lawyer instead of having the case postponed after his attorney's house was broken into and all his files were stolen. This guy's main argument was that it wasn't him because in the statement of probable cause written by the officers after the incident, they misspelled his highly unique last name by adding a T in the middle, E.G. Johnson became Johnston. He spelled his name out at every opportunity with much emphasis. He also argued it couldn't be him because the man on the video tied a T-shirt around his head so that the distinctive tattoos there would be hidden, but he would never cover over his tattoos like that because he was proud of them and they represented his heritage as a Korean man. The jury took less than a half hour to return a guilty verdict. Story 30. Not in court, but a conversation in my office. It doesn't matter if you were sober or not. You jumped out a third-story window with a beer bottle and threw it at a cop. The jury is going to think you were drunk. Also, I think you were drunk. Story 31. I am a lawyer. Colleague argued that it wasn't animal cruelty to shoot a dog because the dog didn't suffer. This wasn't like a euthanasia situation, rather a robbery gone bad. The judge entertained it for a second and then came to her senses. Story 32. As a corporate lawyer, the most ridiculous argument I come across almost monthly is as follows. Fortune 500 company signs a garbage contract and is going to lose a lot of money due to the plain language of that contract. Fortune 500 company argues unconscionability. Specifically that said company was not sophisticated enough to read the contract and no reasonable person would ever agree to the term or terms in dispute. In sum, multi-billion-dollar firms claiming they're incapable of reading contracts. Story 33. I have a story for this one. I'm not a lawyer, nor could I talk at the time, during a custody battle between my grandparents and my mom and dad who were addicts. The judge asks why my parents should have custody. Well, we were his parents. The judge says, well, you guys have substance abuse issues. No, we don't, so you're not using anything. No, we're both clean. When's the last time you've used? A few days ago. And we're done now. My grandparents won that day in court. This story has been told to me a few times by my grandfather. Story 34. Postman claims speeding fine got lost in the post. The judge accepted it too. Story 35. Edit. Actual lawyer here. Hands down, the most ridiculous argument I've ever heard was a constitutionalist, pro-SE defendant, trying to explain why the court lacked jurisdiction over him. I was prepared for the standard arguments about freeman on the land, non-corporate natural person, admiralty court, etc., but this one was different. This particular defendant was part of a Jehovah's Witness compound and happened to be Marshallese American I. He was black, after the court patiently explained to him that it has jurisdiction over all persons in the county. The defendant promptly piped up that, under the Dred Scott decision, he wasn't a person and the court had no jurisdiction. Story 36. Of course, I'm not a lawyer, was doing my journalism degree and was just watching cases all day for an assignment. One guy was up on drug charges for distribution. He was selling weed. His lawyer tried to argue to the judge that we never hurt anyone, and it even made it easier for police during domestic disturbance calls, and that, in fact, the police should be using his client to get weed to calm people down. His client got something like 3 years in jail and 5 years probation. Story 37. This came in a deposition, but it's still one of my funniest stories from this old job. I worked part-time as a paralegal when I was in college. We had this massive case with a lot of people involved that had spun out into a bunch of little side cases. In one of those side cases, this guy was claiming our client had left him threatening voicemails related to the main case, and him and his wife sued for loss of consortium, and I swear to you this is a real thing. Basically means something happened that is stopping a married couple from having, and they want to sue you over it. The guy was claiming that he was so scared from these voicemails that he couldn't sleep with his wife anymore. Deposition time rolls around, and I'm sitting in the other room, but it's a small office and I can hear everything. My boss starts asking the wife how we're supposed to know that it was her client's fault they stopped having. Maybe she's just not as attracted to him anymore. Maybe he's not attracted to her. Maybe they didn't have that much of a life to begin with, etc. So this woman starts yelling "I love" and banging her fists on the table. Her lawyers try to calm her down and tell her to stop talking, but she keeps on shouting "I love." We used to have 2-3 times a day, would be thrown out of hotels because of the noise we'd make. And to the protestation of everyone in the room, her counsel and ours, she proceeded to describe their history in graphic detail, all of which was recorded in the deposition and filed with the court. Story 38 lawyer here. During an order of protection hearing, the 63 muscular tattooed idiot told the judge that my 51 female client deserved the black eye he gave her because she wouldn't stop running her mouth. He actually expected the judge to be sympathetic or something. The second he admitted to hitting her, the judge cut him off and said order of protection granted. Next case. Story 39. Several years ago, I was junior counsel in a prosecution in which the state alleged the 30-year-old male accused penetrated his 13-year-old foster daughter. Part of the state case relied on SMS messages allegedly sent by this gentleman to the complainant. Some of them were pretty bad, I won't repeat them, but there were some which amounted to "sorry, I thought you liked it when I did X." Defense counsel conceded that if he did send those messages, that it would have been very inappropriate. Later, during closing argument, defense counsel argued, surely it would have been more appropriate if he wrote, "You have lovely breasts," or "I want you to have my children," to your 13-year-old foster child, while in the same house you share with your wife. You're right, that's way better. Story 40 lawyer who is not practicing in court, but when I was in college doing my bachelor's degree, criminal law was part of the curriculum, and this included spending a couple of days observing criminal trials, the things you witness. Anyway, at the start of one of these trials, a guy with the greasiest mullet enters the room. Thin, tall, disproportionately sized limbs, tattoos all over. I swear the way he sat before the judge, the only thing that was missing was a beer in his hand and a chicken under his arm. Now, this guy chose not to have a lawyer represent him, as he's a regular and spends short periods of time in jail or doing community service pretty much every month. Anyway, real problem case, drugs, alcoholism, etc. But still, he comes across as a really sympathetic dude and has a really entertaining way of telling a story while keeping a straight face and not realizing how funny he is. He knows he's getting fined and a couple of hours of cutting weeds as community service to keep our Dutch streets nice and tidy, but tries to win the sympathies of the judge to decrease his sentence. This man's dog was sent to a dog shelter when they found it malnourished a couple of weeks before when they brought him in for dealing real sad. But also the reason he's standing trial. The guy got high as a kite and drunk as an Irishman on St. Patrick's, and while completely drugged out of his mind, decided to get his dog back from the shelter because he really missed his girl. The judge asks him if it's correct that he broke the lock and some of the camera equipment on site of the dog shelter, and he confirms. You could really tell from his passionate account of the progression of the evening that he did all this out of pure love, as his dog, according to him, was the only thing that pulled him through all of his rough patches with his girlfriend and his drug problem. So the judge orders camera footage to be shown to confirm that it is the suspect, and he confirms. On it, he is seen stumbling about and wrenching one of the dog enclosures open and hugging a German Shepherd. At this point, everyone is touched by seeing this guy be so emotional on the camera footage with the dog, hugging it, petting it, and playing with it, and you can see the judge really get into it as well. Anyway, so this guy continues with his story and tells about how he took the dog to his car and went home never feeling happier in his life, and ends his account with the driest delivery of needless to say, "I was surprised when I woke up the next day, and there was a German Shepherd in my room instead of a Staffordshire Terrier." Everyone just broke out in laughter. He didn't get what was funny. Turns out the dude stole the wrong dog. Judge sentenced him to 50 hours of community service and 3,000 or so repairs for the broken doors and camera equipment. TLDR guy tries to win sympathies of judge with passionate account of how he broke into a dog shelter and steal his dog back from animal services, steals the wrong dog.